I'm going to talk to you about krill, which I've been working on for the last 20, 25 years here in California. And I want to make this, a very informal session. So if anyone has a question as we're going along, I don't know if you've had a lot of opportunity to do this, but if you look at the, I think there's a reactions button or where you can raise your hand. If you raise your hand, I'll stop and answer your question. There's a little icon that you push that has a bunch of, you can applaud, you can put a thumbs up, and then there's a little tab that you click, raise your hand. And that way it goes right to the top of the screen, and I can field questions. Great. So what I want to talk to you today about is krill. And I kind of want to give you a little krill 101 primer about what they are, the role they play in ecosystems, and then finish off with a little bit more localized story about krill here in our coastal ecosystem and a particular role they play that is a topic I've been working on for several years. So let's start with a little overview of today's talk. So here's our roadmap. We're going to talk about krill. You're going to learn all things krill, about their taxonomy, their anatomy, some of their life history and physiology, and some of their behavior. Then we'll kind of segue into the role that krill play in oceanic food webs, pivotal role they play. And part of that will be what they eat, who eats them, but they actually play a much bigger role, a much broader role. They actually have a critical role in these large scale cycles in ecosystems known as biogeochemical cycles. And krill have a very integral role in the cycling of elements in the marine and global ecosystem, really. And then we'll segue over to a focus on Monterey Bay krill and wind up with a story we like to call the wind whale story, which tells us about the role krill play in a particularly unique trophic interaction or feeding interaction that occurs seasonally here in Monterey Bay. So let's start with what are krill? And we'll start with the name krill. Krill are, the scientific name for krill is euphausiid, and that is a combination of Greek and Latin. The U is more of a Latin root, but it comes from true, and phausia is light. And so the name euphausiid is a reference to the fact that, like many planktonic organisms and other marine organisms, and even terrestrial organisms, krill are able to produce chemical light, bioluminescence, and they do that with specialized organs called photophores. So people noticed this about krill, and so they made reference to that in describing them in this group of organisms. The word krill is actually a Norwegian word, and that was just a term they applied to small larval fish or small fry. So you see these large swarming aggregates, they look like tiny little fry or fish. They use the term krill. It's a very generic term. So krill, big picture, they're members of the phylum Arthropoda, right? So they are organisms that have an exoskeleton and jointed appendages. Members of this group include insects, arachnids, and other chelicerates like spiders and mites and scorpions, and crustaceans. And krill are a member of that group. Arthropods have a exoskeleton and jointed appendages, and they must molt that exoskeleton to grow. So in order for an arthropod to grow, it must shed its outer skin. And it's already created a newer skin underneath, and the first thing it does when it slips out of its old skin is expand that new skin, which is stretchy, to be bigger than the old one, and then harden it, and that's how they grow. And so molting is a requirement for growth. They also have, as their name, the name Arthropoda actually means joint foot. They have segmented appendages with joints. And one other feature that's going to be particularly crucial in understanding life history strategies of krill is all arthropods have sperm that lack flagella, non-motile sperm. So if your sperm are incapable of swimming, that puts kind of a precondition on reproduction. That means that indirect or direct copulation is a requirement for reproduction. So strategies on mating revolve around mechanisms by which the male ensures the delivery of sperm directly to the female or indirectly, either by direct contact or an indirect transfer of a sperm packet. So that will be something we'll talk about a little bit to understand some of the constraints on krill. Now, krill are crustacean arthropods. So crustaceans are predominantly aquatic arthropods. They include the very familiar lobsters, crabs, and shrimps, but there's also a whole host of other organisms. Copepods, which are tiny planktonic organisms, barnacles, which for many years they thought they were more related to mollusks because they have a shell, but actually barnacles are crustaceans that sit attached to the bottom and filter feed. And then even the garden pillbug or sowbug is a crustacean, the only crustacean that's been able to completely transition to a terrestrial lifestyle. Most other crustaceans, all other crustaceans, require, at least for reproduction, a return to an aquatic environment to release their eggs and or larvae. Even land crabs, the famous example of the Christmas Tree Island or Christmas Island, where you have these huge land crab migrations once a year from the mountain forests where they live down to the ocean to release their larvae into the ocean. Now, krill are a particular type of crustacean. Now, this is getting a little in weeds to you, but we're going to keep it as simple as possible. They belong to a large class of crustaceans known as malacostracans, and that's actually Latin for soft shell. Mala is soft, and strakos, actually it's Greek for shell, and I think that's a reference to the fact that it was noted that when large malacostracans like lobsters and crab molted, they had a soft shell before it hardened. Anyone who's ever had soft shell crabs has been the direct beneficiary of that fact. So malacostracans have a very unique body plan. They have a 8+6 formula for their thorax and abdomen, and that's a universal trait among all malacostracans. And so the thorax is usually combined with the head and covered by a carapace, which makes it a single structure called the cephalothorax, which is just a merger of those two body segments. And then the abdomen is usually separate. And so people who ever clean shrimp are probably very familiar with this basic body structure of a crustacean. And all malacostracans have their male reproductive organs situated on their 8th thoracic segment and their female on the 6th. And that's going to come into play when they engage in reproduction. Now, the legs, there are thoracic appendages that they use for either walking or manipulating. And then there are abdominal appendages, which they typically use for swimming. And that's particularly true in the case of krill. We're going to see that krill use their abdominal appendages to swim, and they use their thoracic appendages to filter and capture food from the water. So krill are malacostracans, lobsters and shrimps and crabs, they're all malacostracans, and there's a rich variety. It's the largest, most diverse group of crustaceans in terms of the species diversity, and the largest crustaceans are malacostracans. So krill are perfectly good malacostracans. Now, this is what a krill looks like. And so here's a little in-depth peek of the krill anatomy. That's an actual photograph of an actual local species. You can say they're somewhere around the order of 1.5 to 2 centimeters in length. Large species of local krill are about maximum size of about 2 to 3 centimeters. There's one species that can get up to 3 centimeters. The largest species of krill is the one found in the Southern Ocean, sometimes known as the southern krill or the Antarctic krill, or Euphausiid superba, and they can get up to 6 centimeters in length. They can get quite big. And if you look at a krill, you can see a lot of its internal anatomy right through the semi-transparent exoskeleton it has. So here's a picture of local species Euphausiid pacifica. There's the compound eye that is a trait of many arthropods. Compound eye is an eye that has many, many repeating units. Each one creates a component of the image, much like a pixel of a camera. And the more facets you have on the eye, the sharper the vision. So if you've ever looked at a dragonfly eye, it's huge, and there's thousands of those little units are called ommatidia, and they make very sharp images because they're visual predators. But other species have much fewer, and it's not so much for forming an image, but detecting motion, much better at detecting motion. Right behind the krill's eye, you can see right there, that's its stomach. See, it's right there. So in many cases, the stomach is smaller than the eyes. So here's an example of a species whose eyes really are bigger than its stomach, right? And the stomach is just the initial receiving vessel for food. The food is quickly ground and processed and pushed through, and anything worth digesting is shunted into a large digestive gland, which is located and connected to the stomach. And anything not worthy of digestion is shunted very quickly into the hindgut or the intestine. You can see that running all the way through. That's exactly the same thing that you remove from a shrimp tail when you devein a tail. It's not a vein at all. It's the intestine you're removing from a shrimp when you clean it. And so most of the krill's body of the cephalothorax is either digestive material or the reproductive organs which are in there. And also, it's not labeled down here on this illustration. You can just see this little disc-like structure right there. That's actually the heart. And that's where the heart is located in a krill. And if you get a live specimen and observe it under a scope, you can actually see that heart beating right through the exoskeleton. Most of the tail is muscle. It's used for swimming. And here are the swimmerettes. And these are the feeding legs, the thoracic appendages. Sometimes they're referred to as thoracopods. And you can see they're very hairy. So the krill uses these pleopods or swimmerettes to propel itself through the water. Those are the swimming organs. But it uses these very hairy, the term we use is cetos, CD is Latin for hair, legs to create a basket that they run water through and filter it. So these are primarily the feeding, the food collecting structures of the krill. The mouth is located right here at the base of the stomach. And then located in strategic spots throughout the body in both the cephalothorax and along the abdomen are these photophores, these little light producing organs. We're going to talk a little bit more about what role they play in krill physiology and behavior. Now, how does a krill, so that's basically your krill. It's like it's a miniature version of a shrimp. A shrimp would have a very, very similar internal anatomy to a krill. And you can see the photophores quite clearly as these red dots on the body of the krill here. So how does a krill feed? Well, the main food, most krill, not all, but most krill are primarily herbivorous. They graze on phytoplankton. So they're primary consumers, we would call them. And they extract that phytoplankton from the water. And this is what diatoms is one of the more common forms of phytoplankton. These are single-celled photosynthetic organisms that live in a glass shell. And you can see the chloroplasts of these organisms through their glass shell or frustrum. And so these will be removed and filtered from the water. These are actually scanning electron micrographs of the contents of a krill's stomach. Had a student that looked at krill diet for a while, and you can see these are the ground up glass frustrules or shells of these diatoms. So the krill will extract the diatoms from the water by creating a water current. Let's move the band there. Through its thoracic appendages. So the pleopods drag water through. They make a sort of a circular barrel-shaped structure. And as the water passes through and out, the tiny little phytoplankton are strained from the water by the hairs. Whoop, beg your pardon. Getting ahead of myself. I'm trying to manipulate this little bar here so it doesn't obstruct. Okay. And when enough of that material has been accumulated in that net, they'll go through this motion where they quickly clamp down the whole structure and compress the filtered diatom into a pellet that then they ingest. And once they ingest that pellet, the mandibles, the mouth parts, grind up the material, and then it goes in the stomach where it's kind of milled around and sorted, and then the good stuff goes to the digestive gland, the bad stuff goes out to produce these fecal pellets, which are rich in the ground up frustrules or glass shells of the diatom. So that's how a krill feeds. That's how it extracts this material. Now, there are some species of krill that are primarily predators. They're carnivores. And they have much smaller thoracic appendages that aren't as hairy. And they have often an elongate one that acts like a grabbing or spearing structure that they will pounce on and grab their small prey. But really, most krill are not strict herbivores. They're omnivores. Anything they catch in their net and filter, they'll eat. So a lot of incidental material gets caught up, microorganisms that are not phytoplankton, larvae of other things. So they will be omnivorous in their feeding and opportunistic. But the majority of the food they're targeting for most species is phytoplankton, which puts them in a unique position in the food web. They are the first level of consumption. We call these organisms primary consumers. They represent the first level of energy transfer between living organisms, from the primary producers, which are things like phytoplankton, to the primary consumers. So they make the food available to other consumers in this ecosystem. We'll talk more about that. Krill reproduction, again, the main sexual organs, ovaries and testes, are located in the cephalothorax, and because, like we said, they are arthropods and they must copulate, the male will actually copulate with the female and place a spermatophore in a specialized receptacle on the ventral surface of the thorax of the female called a thalicum, and he'll insert this spermatophore. It might just be a single one. In some species, they do multiple. And that is a stored up reservoir of sperm, and she will not use it right away. Then at some subsequent point, she will ovulate, release her eggs, and as she does, she will liberate the sperm and mix them with her eggs and fertilize her eggs to create fertilized eggs. So there's a disconnect between when the male copulates with the female and when the female ovulates and releases her eggs. Now that part of the process, the release of eggs and sperm, it happens a couple of ways. Most krill are what we call external spawners, free spawners. They spawn out fertilized eggs. So here are a couple of species of this is Antarctic krill, and you can see these little tiny dots in the water. These are fertilized eggs that have been released by the female and just thrown out into the water. So that's what a fertilized krill egg looks like. They're about 300 to 500 microns in diameter. They're not very big, half a millimeter in size. A few species of eggs, like this local species known as, it's actually called Nematocilus difficilis, they'll hang on to the fertilized eggs in special brood sacs that are typically underneath the thorax, and they will release the first larval stage. The larvae will hatch out, and that will be the release spot. So some hang on to their eggs before and release actual larvae, but most species will actually just throw the fertilized egg out in the water column, and it will develop and hatch, and usually within 48 hours. So two slightly different approaches, but the same basic net result is the newly hatched larvae are thrown out on their own in the water column. So there's very little parental care involved in krill life history. And as a result, they produce lots and lots and lots of larvae because not very many of them ever wind up becoming adult krill. It's what we call in ecology, and if you've ever taken a class from Jim, I'm sure he's talked about that, an R-selected species. They produce lots of larvae, offspring, because very few of them survive. There's high mortality early in life. So the strategy is a numbers game, not an investment game. So once that egg is released, the krill go through several distinct life history stages. So the egg will hatch, and the first egg larval stage is known as a nauplius, which is sort of a generic crustacean larval form. If you've ever hatched brine shrimp to feed to fish in an aquarium, it's the nauplius that hatches from the egg of the brine shrimp first, that grows into a larger brine shrimp. So a nauplius is a very common larval form for many species of crustaceans. And then that nauplius will start to molt and add body segments and develop them. So the nauplius then transitions into a form known as a caloptopus, which now has the rudimentary compound eyes, has formed a cephalothorax, and is starting to form abdominal segments. But the caloptopus only has thoracic appendages. It doesn't develop any abdominal appendages. And then as it becomes a little more advanced, it goes into a larval form known as a phercilia. And the phercilia now is starting to look more like a krill, and they'll go through several molts at this stage. And not only do the thoracic appendages continue to develop, but during the phercilia stage, they start to add and develop abdominal appendages to their body. And then finally, what they transition into a juvenile stage, and the juvenile stage is basically got all the parts of the adult. It's just sexually immature, and then it will grow in size but not change in form much until it matures sexually, and then you have your adult. So the complete life history is a female will release a fertilized egg. It will happen to a nauplius. There's a sort of a second naupliar stage known as the metanauplius, where the abdomen begins to protrude. Then you get into the caloptopus stage. There's typically 3 calyptosis stages where it grows bigger and develops more and more abdominal segments and thoracic appendages, and then it transitions into a Physalia, starts developing the abdominal appendages, and then finally becomes a juvenile, and at that point, it's going to grow up. And the time it takes to go through this rotation varies between species. So for our local species, it's about a 2-month time frame from egg to adult. It takes about 2 months to go through that whole phase. But in the Southern Ocean, the Antarctic krill, it might take a year or 2 years for them to mature into adults. So it's a slower process, and they're longer lived. So it varies between species. Now, krill undergo an interesting behavior that many species of plankton do, known as diurnal vertical migration. And it's a daily migration in which most of these organisms will come up to the surface at night to feed, but then migrate down to depths during the day. And the reason for doing this are multiple, but the main reason is you want to be out of the light. When you're in the light, you're visible to predators. And so by migrating down to depth where it's dimmer, there's less light, it's harder to be spotted, it's a anti-predator defense. But there are ancillary benefits that come from this process. Typically, the deeper you go, the colder it is. So if you're not feeding during the day, by being colder, you're saving energy. These are ectothermic organisms. Their body temperature varies with the external environment. So they're metabolically more efficient when they go down at depth and cool off. And there may be other benefits because the surface layers and the subsurface layers often move in different directions. So much like a hot air balloonist, if they move up and down between layers, even though they can't swim against the currents, that's the definition of a plankton species. Plankton means wanderer in Greek. They're at the mercy of the currents. But a skilled hot air balloonist is not necessarily at the mercy of the winds. If they know something about the winds, and they can move up and down in different direction winds. They can exert some control over where they go. And that's sort of the idea behind plankton. Now, it's not like plankton are putting out their current meters and measuring the current at the surface and subsurface, saying, okay, I want to wind up here. Well, how much time? These are currents that are well structured and predictable. And so over evolutionary timescales, behaviors that move up and down between these currents that result in the optimum distribution are selected for. And so that what becomes ingrained in the sort of the repertoire of these organisms. Now, in terms of krill, this behavior shows a distinct variation with life history. So you can see that during the night, they're all up on the surface. Why? Because that's where the food is. That's where the phytoplankton is, right? But during the day, they scatter to different depths, and it's very much a function of two things: their size and their ability to swim. Their size is going to have an influence on their visual detection threshold. The bigger you are, the less light you need to be seen. So the bigger you are, the darker an environment you need to retreat to be less noticeable. The size also translates in your ability to swim. The bigger you are, the farther you can swim up and down every day and make it. So you can see that they distribute themselves in the water column at very different levels during the day. The larval stages and the eggs are up near the surface, whereas as they start getting bigger into the Physalia stage and the juvenile and the adult, the amplitude of their migration every day increases. And that's going to put larvae and adults in very different circulation regimes, and they wind up having influence of where the larvae versus the adults go. And that's something we'll come back to at the end of the talk to show something to explain a phenomena that occurred here in California that we studied. Okay, so they migrate. That's a very common behavior in oceanic organisms, particularly in planktonic organisms. But fish and squid do the same thing as well. And so not only do they migrate, but they change their distribution as a function of their migration. So when they go down at day to be in the dimmer light, they tend to aggregate up in these distinct scattering layers that you can see using things like hydroacoustics. They bunch up at depth. But when they come up at night, they spread out, because it would not make sense to feed as a filter feeder all bunched up, because whoever's in the middle is getting highly filtered water by the time it gets to them, and they're not getting a lot of food. So you can see that these krill tend to spread out on the surface and become less concentrated, but they bunch up during the day because bunching up also provides some anti-predator benefit. Aggregations provide a couple of benefits. First, when you're in aggregation, it's harder to target an individual. If you ever looked at a school of fish and tried to keep track of one individual fish, it's very confusing. So if you're a predator trying to target an individual, the swarm activity makes it very disorienting. But secondly, your risk is amortized when you're in a school, right? When you're one of many, your individual predation risk is minimal. But if you're out on your own and a predator comes along, you're pretty much what it's focused on. So it's a way of amortizing or spreading out the risk as well. And so it's a very effective anti-predator defense for krill for most of their predators. I say most because most of the things that eat krill, as we're going to see, eat individual krill. But it's the one thing they do that actually makes them something that whales consider eating, because if they didn't do this aggregating behavior, whales wouldn't bother with them. And we'll come back to that as well. So they do this. Not only do they move up and down at night, but when they go down at depth, they aggregate in these subsurface scattering layers, these swarms. When they come at night, up at night, they tend to spread out. Now, every once in a while, for reasons that are not completely understood, krill get caught at the surface during the day. And there have been various mechanisms proposed to explain this. One is that these are mating aggregations, particularly when they happen around here. These are all large, very ripe reproductive individuals that are aggregating. So they may be aggregating to copulate and exchange sperm. So this might be a mating aggregation, but it's also maybe that they get forced up through forcing mechanisms, water coming up that pushes them to the surface. And when they get caught in the light and the predators underneath of them, their natural instinct is to herd up as tight as they can. And so they bunch up so tightly in these surface swarms that literally I've seen krill getting pushed out of the water on the backs of the krill underneath them. That's how tight these aggregations get. And all of a sudden, that's a huge feeding resource. So when they do this, a lot of things that eat krill take advantage of this easy pickings, right? But a lot of things that don't normally eat krill will target and eat krill in these aggregations because they're in a form that they can take advantage of. So not only will whales feed on krill surface swarms, but things like blue sharks, which don't normally feed on krill, will eat them. Or gray whales. I've seen gray whales, which are not filter feeding whales. They're bottom straining whales. But when there's a surface swarm, hey, there it is. It's easy to take. Go for it. This is a couple of photographs taken on Labor Day back in 2001 of some huge surface swarms. You can see the red coloration is all krill. Now on the left is a basking shark that's running through and feeding on that krill. That's about a 30, 35 foot long basking shark, which are occasional visitors to Monterey Bay. And it's taking advantage of this surface swarm. And on the right are two blue whales. They're about 70 feet long each. And they are slashing through these surface swarms and just taking full advantage of these easy pickings. Now, surface swarms are very unpredictable and relatively rare in krill. So they're not the normal way that krill predators target krill. But when they occur, many species will opportunistically take advantage of them. Like, and in the case of the whale, it's like your food comes to you. You don't have to go down to the restaurant to get your food. It's delivered up to the surface where you're breathing. So it's a form of, yeah, as my wife just said, DoorDash. All right. Now, another thing krill do is they produce light. That's where their name euphausiid come from. They are a bioluminescent organism. And they, like I said, they produce light in these specialized organs called photophores. And you can see the photophores. This is a photograph of a krill in the lab looking underneath from the bottom up, the ventral surface of that krill. And those are the actual photophores producing light in a particular wavelength. And the color of that light is very, very intentional. And we're going to talk about why they bioluminesce. But first, it might be useful to know what bioluminescence is. Bioluminescence is chemical light. Sometimes it's erroneously referred to as phosphorescence. It's not. Phosphorescence is abiotic or non-living light. It's a similar process. But what happens in bioluminescence is a substance known as luciferin, right, is oxidized by a protein known as oxyluciferase to produce, luciferase, to produce this compound luciferin. And when that happens, it releases chemical light. It takes light energy stored at higher energy levels. And when it's oxidized, it releases some of that energy as photons at a particular wavelength of light. And it can just either be a random reaction or it can be modulated. So sometimes there are specialized proteins that can be triggered by chemical mechanisms, in this case calcium, to catalyze that reaction. These are proteins. I'm reaching back to my MCD days, Barry, but is this an example of an apoprotein that has a binding site to trigger the active site?
Sort of.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, but there are proteins that have to be activated by an external trigger sometimes, as opposed to ones that just work when they're in solution.
Yes.
Anyway. And this would be one example, which allows it to control it. And the way they control that is by delivering these materials through supplying the hemolymph or the blood to the photophores to enact this. There are all kinds of ways that this is done in nature, but in krill, it's done through this reaction in a tightly regulated fashion in these photophores. Now, why have light? Why do it? Well, the bioluminescence is for a variety of functions in organisms that produce it. One of the main functions of bioluminescence is messaging, signaling. They use it to transmit light signals. So for instance, glow bugs in the garden, they produce a form of bioluminescence. They're signaling other glow bugs and trying to communicate. They can be used in a deceptive way, like the anglerfish that has a little bioluminescent lure that allures in other fish. But one of the main uses of bioluminescence is something that's very counterintuitive, because they produce this light when they're in the dark. And they produce this light to hide in the dark. And that makes no sense whatsoever until you realize that it's not 100% dark. So if you look at what water does, water is a very effective light filter, right? As you go deeper in water, more and more of the light is filtered out. If you've ever been scuba diving and you get down to deeper, you notice everything gets drab and gray and blue. And it's not because it doesn't have colors, it's because the wavelengths of light that would be reflected to show you those colors aren't there. And then you take a bunch of underwater photographs and you look at them when you go home and everything's so bright and vivid. And you say, I don't remember it being this bright and vivid. That's because when you provide that flash, you provide that light to actually see the colors of these organisms. So the lowest energy wavelengths are the red wavelengths. They get filtered out first. And then as you go deeper, it filters out to yellow and blue and green, and then finally blue. I'm sorry, yellow and green, and then finally blue. So the blue light transmits the deepest. Now, krill are usually occupying this level somewhere around this range during the day. So if you were a predator looking up at a krill, you would see the silhouette of that krill highlighted against that blue background. But if that krill were be able to produce light that was of a similar wavelength to that background, like that, it would break up the outline of that krill and cause it to be harder to detect. It wouldn't present such a cross-sectional area. That's what we call counter illumination. Is you're blending in with the light that's backdropping you from predators underneath that are looking up. And that's one of the main forms that bioluminescence for many organisms. They use those photophores to create light that allow them to break up their outline and blend in more completely with the backscatter or the downwelling light. And so krill of different species that have different depths will actually fine tune that. So one species of krill we have here lives more down around 200 meters during the day. They have a bluer tinged light they produce with their photophores. But another species is more around in this range. They have more of a sort of a teal or a greenish blue colored light, because their selection has fine tailored the wavelength to match more closely with the wavelength of light that's dominant at that level. So it's really quite clever what's happening. So they use their bioluminescence to avoid predators that would target them individually. But they may actually be one of the ways that whales locate these scattering layers. They locate them by location, but when they dive down, how do they know how dense the krill is? There's one theory, it's highly speculative at this point, that they gauge the density of the krill swarm by the intensity of the bioluminescence being performed by it. They can see that when we're down there checking it out. Now I want to transition and talk a little bit about the role krill play in food webs. And the main role they play is they're sort of a key transfer species. They are the species that transfer the energy that is brought into the system from the non-living environment, sunlight, by phytoplankton, and they make that chemical energy available to a multitude of predators. So they are a transfer species. I toyed around with coming up, Barry mentioned that Jim Estes has talked to the OLLI groups before or given classes, and he's very famous for working with a group of organisms known as keystone species, and keystone species are top predators. And that was a term coined by Bob Payne in the late 60s, initially to describe the role that sea stars play in the intertidal. So we all want to come up with names for our organisms. So I thought, well, what would describe the role that krill play in food webs? And I thought maybe linchpin or species, right? The linchpin is the pin that transfers the force of the engine to the components of the motor, right? So here's the force of the engine here. Here are the components of the ecosystem, and krill are transferring that energy out everywhere. And they do that in a unique way. Most things that eat phytoplankton are very small, which means that they are in turn eaten by things a little bit bigger than them, which are eaten by things a little bit bigger than them. But krill tap right into this phytoplankton, but they're big enough to be individual prey for a variety of species. So 7 of the 10 most valuable commercial fish species, things including rockfish, salmon, squid, have krill as one of their principal components of their diet. So they're targeting directly on krill. In fact, some work I did with one of the NIMS researchers showed that the abundance of juvenile krill in the Gulf of the Farallones was the best predictor of the health and return of Chinook salmon stocks to rivers 3 years after, or 2 years after they leave their rivers and return. Because when they first come into the coastal ecosystem, they feed primarily on these krill larvae, and the more of that is available, the healthier they are and the better their survival to adulthood is. So they're a very important species for a number of commercially valuable species. A number of seabirds target krill as their primary diet for resource. The one you see down there is a species we have locally called Cassin's auklet. It feeds almost exclusively on krill. It will feed on fish larvae as well. But of course, penguins feed on krill in the Antarctic. There are many, many species of seabirds that feed on krill. And of course, many species of whales feed on krill. And that's going to be sort of the focus of the end of our talk, talking about this relationship between krill and whales. So it might be useful to expand on how it is that krill, something that's less than 2 inches in length, can be the main food source for the largest animal that ever lived, the blue whale. Because here's the scale right there. That's what a krill looks like to a human hand, and there's a human compared to an adult blue whale. Yet that krill is sustaining that whale. How is that possible, right? Well, first let's talk about what makes this system work. And it's all economics and budgeting and efficiency. Because the general rule of thumb is that every time energy transfers from one trophic level to another, there's about a 10% transfer rate of the energy. It's a very inefficient process. Most of the energy never gets transferred and made into biomass at the next level. So 1,000 calories of phytoplankton that are ingested by krill eventually form 1,000 calories of new krill biomass, and 100 calories of new krill biomass. And 100 calories of krill ingested by a baleen whale is enough to produce 10 calories of whale biomass. It's a very inefficient transfer process, right? And you can see the ramifications of that if you have long food chains. So let's put it in economic terms. If you start with $100 of phytoplankton, that's enough to make $10 worth of krill, which is going to make you $1 worth of blue whale. But now take that same phytoplankton and it gets eaten by a krill, $10 of krill get eaten by a salmon. You make $1 worth of salmon. The salmon gets eaten by a sea lion. It's enough to make 10 cents of sea lion. And the orca eats the sea lion, there's 1 cent. So in food chain 1, $100 produces $1 at the top. In food chain two, $100 produces 1 cent at the top. Everyone takes their cut, so long food chains are very inefficient. And that's part of the reason these guys have such a big impact on the environment they live in. They are energetically expensive. It takes a lot of resources to sustain a pound of orca in an ecosystem, right? So blue whales have taken the strategy of cutting out all the retail and they're shopping wholesale. They're going right to the source, and it's the krill that let them do that, right? But it's only because the krill behave in a way that lets them be exploited by the whales. If they didn't behave a certain way, whales couldn't get away with this, couldn't do this. So to understand that, you have to understand how a whale feels. Krill-eating whales belong primarily to a group of baleen whales known as rorqual whales. Now, rorqual whales are gulpers. They have expandable throat pleats that allow them to take huge gulps of seawater. And you can see it expands. There's a picture of a blue whale at the surface that's just come up from a feeding dive. You can see there's its huge expanded gular pleats that make this huge, basically the same thing a pelican does when it dives in and takes a big old glob of water. What's different is how they filter it. So they'll take a big glob of water and food, either fish or krill. And then as they push that water back out through their baleen with their tongue, it's forced out through the baleen plates and the water exits out, but the krill are sieved and retained. And by the time the tongue's completely pushed all that water out and expelled it, you're left with this concentrated, basically 1-ton glob of krill that can then be swallowed by the whale. So whales don't eat krill. That's one of the biggest fallacies that are put out there. Whales don't eat krill, they eat schools of krill. And if the krill don't aggregate, whales won't feed on them. So when they do this, they're whale food. When they do this, they're not whale food. So this behavior, this very behavior that they do to avoid predators is what makes them whale prey. If they didn't do that, whales wouldn't feed on them. And you might ask, well, then why do they do that? Well, probably a couple reasons. Whales, on the order of things, have been preying on krill, probably the most recent of krill predators. Everything else has been around a lot longer, eating on krill. So a lot of these behaviors are in response to those selective pressures that have shaped krill evolution. But secondly, whales represent a very small portion of the consumers in the ecosystem. So they probably represent a very small impact on krill populations. Many more krill get eaten by things like fish and jellies and squids and things of that nature, because the biomass of those organisms is much higher globally in oceans. So that is what is selected for, the defense that works against most of krill predators. And it just happens to make them whale food. And because of that, whales have found out a way, baleen whales, to target this very low level of the food web and avoid a lot of this energy inefficiency. And that's part of the reason blue whales are so big. They're able to sustain that huge biomass because they're getting their energy to them, that level, much more efficiently by a much more direct food chain that they're tapping into. Okay. And so this is some data from a time depth recorder. Some people I work with, we would go out and they would shoot a little crossbow that would stick in the side of the whale and put this time depth recorder. Now they've refined it to suction cups. And it records the depth and time that the whales dive. And then at a certain point, it's programmed to release and you recover it and you download the data. And you can see this particular whale was diving down during the day to about a depth of 140 meters and then doing a series of these lunge bursts through a krill layer in which it's gulping water and grabbing krill. And then it will come up to the surface like that photograph we showed, spell out that water, filter out the krill, swallow it, go back down and go for another one. So they are targeting dense aggregations of krill. That's what they're looking for to feed. If they happen to find one on the surface, so much the better, but that's very infrequent. So what they're targeting are these daytime, subsurface, dense aggregations of krill, which is their food resource. But the role krill play is much bigger than just food for predators. they play a key role in the overall economy of the ecosystem. So we talk about these cycles in ecosystems, biogeochemical cycles, and these are cycles that track uh, the, uh, the path of elements, key matter in ecosystems. And if you learn the key matter of life is the acronym CHNOPS, that stands for carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, sulfur. These are the building blocks, the atoms that are the bulk of the building blocks for biological molecules. And so they move back and forth between living systems and inorganic abiotic components. And they can occur in one of three forms, either locked up in living organisms, in which that's the bio and biogeochemical. They can be in geologic formations like sediments or rocks, that's the geo, or they can be in small compounds, or even in single element molecules, and dissolved in either the air, water, or soil. That's the chemical. And these elements move back and forth in different states in these cycles. And so matter's cycled in an ecosystem. The energy flows one way, but the matter's cycled. And so you can see in terms of the krill, you've got these elements locked up in the body of the krill, but the krill will molt like all crustaceans, and there is a lot of carbon, fluorine, there's phosphorus, there's calcium bound up in the exoskeleton that will then degrade and be regenerated back to free nutrients available for reuptake of these elements. They excrete fecal pellets, which are rich in nitrogen, phosphorus, and iron, and they'll either dissolve into the immediate environment or sink down at depth. So the fecal pellets of krill represent a transport of these elements from the surface layer down deep. The molts of krill will also sink. It produces a phenomena that was studied for many years by one of our faculty members here at UCSC, Mary Silver, as marine snow, which is this rain of organic material from the surface layer down to the deep sea, which is one of the main sustaining energy sources for the deep sea. They'll excrete things like ammonia and phosphate from their gills. The gills of krill are located at the base of their thoracic legs. And these will go into the water and be available as a source of phosphorus and nitrogen to photosynthesizers in the surface layer. And there's even some evidence to suggest that when large aggregations of krill swim from subsurface to the surface, the turbulence they cause in this swimming can actually cause mixing and bring nutrients from down deep up to the surface. So they actually may form a physical mixing mechanism to bring subsurface nutrients to the surface, where they're usually much more limiting. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So this is sort of a synopsis of the role that krill might play in, say, the Southern Ocean ecosystem. So they have various roles. So you can see that CO2 is being drawn down from the atmosphere to form phytoplankton. And that phytoplankton is the main food for krill. So there's grazing going there. The krill create fecal pellets, which is a form of this organic transport that some of it dissolves back in the surface layer, some of it sinks down. Krill migrate. So when they poop at depth, that's going to represent an accelerated transport of this material to the deep sea. In certain environments like like regions of the Antarctic, there's actually downwelling that can increase the rate of that export down to the deep sea. They're excreting things like ammonia and iron in their urine and their feces and through their gills, and that is often a limiting element for phytoplankton that need these things. Iron is needed in very small amounts for photosynthesizing organisms, but it becomes very limited in the surface because it comes from rocks, and the nearest rocks are 10,000 feet below. So iron is very limited in the open ocean, and this is a form of resupplying iron, which is a key component that phytoplankton need. So they're playing a very big role when they take this carbon from the surface layer and transport it in their fecal pellets and molts to the deep sea. That's a way of sequestering carbon down in the deep sea. So they play a role in removing carbon from the atmosphere and then transporting the deep sea, where it has a much longer residence time. So they are part of the mitigation of atmospheric carbon as well. So they play a global role in regulating the ecosystem. And by sheer virtue of their huge abundance in world's oceans, that impact is not negligible. It's a very significant impact in the overall carbon budget of the biosphere, that they're playing this sort of really vital role. Okay, so hopefully you have a little bit better understanding of what krill are, what they do, and how they affect ecosystems. So now I want to kind of finish off by focusing in on a local story, talking about krill in the California current ecosystem. The California current ecosystem is a large marine ecosystem that is really the west coast boundary of the United States and Canada and Mexico. And the California current is this broad, shallow, sluggish current. It's what, if you take oceanography, it's known as an eastern boundary currents. They tend to be shallow in depth, slow, they meander, they have lots of gyres and eddies, as opposed to western boundary currents, like the example that you're probably familiar with, the Gulf Stream. They tend to be narrow and deep and fast, and they flow in opposite directions. Eastern boundary currents flow from high latitudes to low latitudes. Western boundary currents flow from low latitudes to high latitudes. And it's all part of this balance of ocean circulation. We live in this regime here where you have the California current kind of running down along our entire coast, and it plays a major influence on the structure of our marine ecosystem here. And we're going to zoom in and look at Monterey Bay down here. And we're going to look at two key krill species and trying to understand a little bit about their population dynamics here, and then finish with the story about how it all segues into why we get annual visits from things like blue whales here in Monterey Bay. So let's meet the players involved. There are two main species involved in this story of krill. Euphausiid pacifica is the most abundant. It's got a very broad distribution. You find it right around the North Pacific, from California all right across to Japan, and out far into the middle of the ocean. It's a widespread, and it can be abundant both near shore and offshore. So it's a broadly distributed organism. And they get to a maximum size of about 22, 23 millimeters. That's a large individual. The other player that it factors into our local krill population dynamics is this guy, Thyanosa spinifera. It's called spinifera because it has these really big spines sticking back on the top of its abdomen. That's a much larger species of krill, about 50% bigger. They get up to about 30, 34 millimeters maximum size. They're a much more coastal or neritic species of krill. They're located largely in upwelling centers. If you don't know what that is, we're going to talk about upwelling in just a minute. So they're a much more nearshore distributed krill. They tend to be found where you have intense coastal upwelling, and they like cooler water. They're a cooler species. And they're bigger, and they're a little richer in things like oils and lipids. And for that reason, whales really love to feed on these guys. This is really premium whale food. Whales will feed on the other species too, but this is what they really love when they find it. And interesting, going back to that bioluminescence, they have a shallower distribution. They don't migrate as deep. So this species has that more blue-green color to its bioluminescence, whereas Euphausia has a more bluish color to its bioluminescence because they're producing light that works better at their daytime depth, which is kind of an interesting aside. All right. So let's talk about the winged whale stories. How does it all factor in? Well, to understand the story, you got to get to the heart of it. What drives this whole story? And it's all driven by the wind. That's why we call it the wind. The story tells you how you start with wind and wind up with whales, right? So it's the wind that's driving it. Why? Because in the ocean, there's this paradox, right? This sort of disconnect between where there's enough light and where there's enough nutrients. Because where do nutrients come from? The breakdown of organic material. So on land, nutrients are in the soil. Something dies, it falls down the soil, it's retained, breaks down, it creates a nutrient pool in the soil that's then reused by the plants growing in the soil. But in the ocean, when something dies, it sinks. And by the time it breaks down, it's so deep, there's no light. So where there's enough nutrients for phytoplankton, there's not enough light. Where there's enough light, there's no nutrients. So that's what limits much of the photosynthetic activity in the open ocean, the lack of nutrients. But if there's some way of bringing those deep, nutrient-rich waters back up to the surface, then you can subsidize phytoplankton production. And that's exactly what coastal upwelling does. What coastal upwelling does is wind energy gets transferred to the surface layer. But because the Earth's spinning, it causes a deflection of 45 degrees. It's known as Coriolis deflections to the right in the northern hemisphere. So if the wind blows just from the right direction along the coast of California from the northwest, it causes the surface layer to bend 45. The surface layer makes the layer underneath it bend 45. And if you were to integrate all of that energy, you'd have a net movement of water 90 degrees from the direction of the wind flow, but only on the surface layer, the top 40 to 50 meters of the ocean surface. It's moving offshore. Now, when that water moves offshore, there's no water over here to come over and replace it. So it pulls the water down deep up to replace it. And this is cold because it's been down dark out of the sun, and very high nutrient-rich water. And you're bringing that cold, nutrient-rich water to the surface and making it available to phytoplankton where the sunlight is. And it's like throwing gas on a fire. It spurs real high production of phytoplankton. You get phytoplankton blooms as a result of this coastal upwelling. You can see it from space. These are two different satellite images. The one on the left is called an AVHRR image. That stands for Advanced Very High Resolution Radiometer. It's a satellite in space that's got three little probes that detect heat flux. And one's aimed at the surface of the planet, and two are aimed at deep space. And it's able to, through an algorithm, calculate the difference in flux and estimate what the sea surface temperature is to within 1/10 of a degree centigrade. So you can measure sea temperature from space, and it's plotted on a map. Cold colors are cold, warm colors are hot. You can see the coldest water is right near the coast. This is the water being brought up from depth and upwelling, bringing that nutrient-rich water to the surface. The offshore waters of the California current are relatively warmer. It's not something you'd want to go jumping into. Trust me, 13 degrees is still cold, but this is super cold, 9-degree water. Anything below 11 degrees is pretty high in nutrients. This satellite is an ocean color sensor. It detects light being emitted, and it detects the light being emitted from a variety of pigments, but it can detect the light that's typically released through the photosynthesis process. Not all the light is absorbed. In fact, green light is released. So you're not seeing the color of the light. It's just a measure of the intensity of light being reflected, which is then translated to chlorophyll abundance. So this satellite is showing you how much chlorophyll is in the water. And chlorophyll is an estimate of how much phytoplankton is in the water. So you can see the high chlorophyll levels are all right here on the coast, right where all the cold nutrient-rich water is. There's a relationship between where the nutrient-rich water is supplied and where the chlorophyll is. And you can see that's where you're going to have lots of phytoplankton. And that means that's where krill are going to feed and have good food conditions. And you can see this through time. Now, upwelling is not uniform throughout the year. This is some data from NOAA showing you average upwelling levels over the last 60 years. And you can see that upwelling is strongest in the spring and early summer. That's when you have the strongest upwelling favorable winds. This is don't worry about the metrics. This is an upwelling index. It's an estimate of how many cubic meters per second per 100 meters of coastline is coming up from depth, right? And they calculate that completely theoretically from wind stress and all of that, right? It's a derived product. But it tells you how much deep water is coming to the surface, and it's peaking in the spring and early summer. And you can actually see this in a vertical profile. This is some data from Mbari showing for a 20-year period, or about a 15-year period, the temperature of the water, and you can see the cold water regularly comes up to the surface and then goes down, comes up, goes down, comes up, goes down. And where the blue comes near the surface is where you have strong upwelling. Where the blue retreats down and you have more warm colors, that means lack of upwelling and surface warming. And you can see it's an episodic cyclical phenomena that has some interannual glitches. So there's a really big red glitch. That's 1998. What did we have then? A huge El Nino. And we're going to talk about that El Nino at the very end. So you can see that it's a predictable phenomenon. So if you eat phytoplankton, you can time when you're around to eat it to when there's going to be a lot of phytoplankton around. It's not an unknown commodity. There's a good chance that if you show up in the spring and early summer, there's going to be a lot of food for you to feed on, right? And krill have evolved to take advantage of this predictable process that occurs right here on our coast. So let's look at some krill data. This is some data from one of the species collected from our Wind to Whales program. And we only sampled in January and February in the winter because because of it's hard to schedule. The conditions are usually bad at work. But we would go out monthly from May to October for a period of about almost 10 years. And you can see that krill abundances are very low in the winter, and then they skyrocket in May. And then they decline, but then there's a second peak, and then they decline again for this species. We're going to make sense of that in a minute, right? But clearly, this is not a good time to be in Monterey Bay if you're a whale, right? This would be a better time to be in Monterey Bay. You might think this would be the time to be in Monterey Bay if you're a whale eating krill, but you would be wrong. And we're going to see why in a minute, because it's not how much krill, it's how much adult krill is around that matters to the whales. So let's look at these 2 months, May and August, these two peaks right here, May and August, and look at the size structure of the krill population. These are size classes in millimeters from 5 to about 23 millimeters. And this is the number relative abundance. And you can see in May, there's a huge number of very small juvenile krill around, not so many adults. But by August, this cohort of juvenile krill have grown into adults. And there's a second wave coming in because they keep reproducing, right? So you can see the peak goes from largely unimodal to bimodal. And these are large krill. These are whale food. These are not. And so the whales have taken advantage of this predictable krill population dynamic. If you look at when you see whales in Monterey Bay, here's some data from whale watching boats and scientific rail. This is the average number of blue whales started in Monterey Bay over a 4-year period. You can see blue whales are rare most of the year, but they become much more common in July, August, September. That's when whales show up here. Blue whales show up here. Why? Why do they only show up here? Interesting question. And if you look at where you find the blue whales in Monterey Bay, that is not a random pattern, is it? Right? It is not just a random distribution of red dots. Each red dot is a sighting. They seem to be aggregating around a structure. That's the Monterey Submarine Canyon, and they're aggregating right around the edge of the canyon. Why is that? Well, to do that, we studied that. We tracked whales, and what you're looking at here, let me explain it. This is the surface where you got these lines. That's the surface of the ocean. This is the edge of the Monterey Canyon. That's about 120 meters deep right there. The canyon causes the bottom to break down quite deeply. These red squiggles are surface or subsurface aggregations of krill that we measure using sound, hydroacoustics, and we can recreate this in this curtain plot. So you can see right about 150 meters, you have these dense aggregations of krill feathering off from the edge of the canyon. What this is the path a blue whale took on the surface swimming as it dove down and did those lunge feeds through the aggregation of krill. So it knew it would be likely find krill near the edge of the canyon. So it comes to the canyon, dives down. We're not sure, but it probably, if it dives down to the right depth and sees a lot of bioluminescence, it starts lunge feeding and eating krill. So the whales are targeting the krill, but which krill are they targeting? How can we figure out which krill the whales are eating? How do you figure out what a whale eats? Well, how do you figure out what anything eats? Anybody want to suggest? Barry?
You look at the poop.
You look at the poop. So how do you look at whale poop? Well, it's no trivial task. You got to catch it just at the right time, but that's what a whale poop looks like. Boom. And when we see that, it's like gold. We rush in there, scoop it up. There's some prime whale poop. And then we preserve it and we can pick through it, and the krill get digested, but their mouth parts don't. They're hard. So you can pick out mouth parts, and you can even pick out left and right mandibles. And it turns out that different species of krill have different shaped mandibles, and you can identify the species of krill by the shape of the mandible. And it's even better. You can measure a certain part of the mandible, and it's a good predictor of what the size of that krill was that had that mandible. So there's a good relationship between the length of a particular part of the mandible and the length of the krill. And so we can take krill mandibles from whale poop and reconstruct the size structure of the krill that was being eaten by that whale.
Why is it so red?
Well, there's a lot of keratines in that krill, right? So it's the reg pigment that gets concentrated. And when we do that, we can see what they're feeding on. So these are some size frequency plots. There are two sets of plots. The light gray bars are the size distribution. Someone has a, is that a chat question or? Oh, is this, I'm sorry. I don't know John Beaton, but we can talk about that afterwards. I'm so used to responding to chats when I'm teaching, you know, usually I have a question. So the light gray bars are the size distribution of these two species of krill from nets. The dark gray bars are the reconstructed size distribution of the krill in the poop. And we put the two size classes side by side. So each of these have, there's two 15 millimeter size classes, two 16. So we do one for the krill, one for the whale poop. So you can compare what the whale's eating with versus what's there. And the best example is for this species of krill here. You can see that there are a big cohort of these juveniles in there. The whales are only eating the adults, right? They're not eating the juveniles. And it's not clear whether they're not targeting the juveniles, that the juveniles and the adults separate in space, or whether the juveniles just go through their baleen and are not effectively retained by the baleen. It's probably the former and not the latter. But the point is, this is not whale food. This is whale food. So whales are not targeting krill, they're targeting adult krill. So it doesn't make sense to be in Monterey Bay when there are no adult krill or very low numbers of adult krill. So the whales have figured out that when you want to be here is here, because that in May, there's very few large adults in the krill population. They're mostly juveniles. But in August, the abundance of adults is much higher. So they're showing up in Monterey Bay during this critical window when you have sufficient abundance of these larger adult krill. That's all linked into the natural life cycle of krill within our system, which has a very seasonal, predictable cycle. So they show up in the summertime when the krill is ripe here for the taking. And they go other places because different parts of the California current, the krill mature at different times of the year. And in Mexico, in the Sea of Cortez, the species of krill down there tends to peak in terms of adult abundance in the fall. So I'll go down there and feed in the fall and the winter. And so they move around and kind of move around from different parts of the system, which they can do very easily because they're very big and they can swim long distances. And they show up when it's time to feed. And while they're in a particular region, they move around from spot to spot, looking for these dense aggregations of adult krill. So the whales have figured out the krill's yearly cycle, and they've kind of tuned their behavior to respond to that. But what happens when a big wrench gets thrown in the works? How do the whales respond to that? So we had a very big disruption to the system. The 97-98 was a huge El Nino. And the benefit of this El Nino versus the last really big one we had in 82, 83, was we had much better forecasting and we could see it coming this time. NOAA puts an array of buoys out all across the equatorial Pacific, and it measures water depth and temperature and depth of the thermocline, all these factors, and you can see the El Nino forming and propagating towards the coast months in advance. So they were warning us, there's a big El Nino coming. We all got ready to study it because El Ninos represent disturbances in the system. And a lot of times you learn about the system by studying how it responds to disturbance. It gives you insights into the workings of the system. So we were all ready to see, okay, what's going to happen? Now, what normally happens in El Nino? Well, in El Nino, what happens is the whole mechanics of the tropical Pacific get thrown in reverse. So normally you have strong trade winds blowing from east to west, and they blow surface waters ahead, and that causes the thermocline to tilt, meaning that in the eastern Pacific, the cold, nutrient-rich water is closer to the surface than the western Pacific. And it's all driven by these trade winds pushing it. But in El Nino, the trade winds break down, the seesaw tilts, and the thermocline lowers, and you get all of this warm water rushing in, hitting the coast of North America, and then propagating up and down, bringing warm water, tropical species. The opposite of El Nino is when you have stronger than normal trade winds that blow the water, and you have really cold conditions in the eastern tropical Pacific. That's called La Nina. So La Ninas are the opposite of El Ninos. Now, one of the implications of these El Ninos is you have less nutrients being brought to the surface. So phytoplankton production goes way down. So in a normal system, you have a shallow thermocline, a lot of plankton in the water, a lot of forage species feeding on that plankton, things like whales and seabirds feeding on the forage species. But the paradigm, the convention is that in El Ninos, you have a deep thermocline, not so much nutrients in the water, less plankton in the water, less forage, fewer marine mammals, and seabirds that can't find food will just abandon nesting during El Ninos. They just won't even reproduce. So El Ninos are big disruptions to the system, to temperate systems like we have here. So we were going to see whether that translated to our system. If an El Nino, are you going to have less phytoplankton, meaning less krill, meaning fewer whales coming to the system? That's what we predicted. And we were all ready to document this. And we had basically we had written our papers, we had the introductions, the discussions, the methods, all there. All we were waiting for were the results. Throw them in there and publish, right? Okay, because we understood our system and we knew we could predict what was going to happen, right? So here's some data. So here's krill abundance in red, measured acoustically. Here's whale abundance and sightings. And you can see that whale abundance and krill abundance before and after the El Nino track magnificently, right? Whales abundant correlate very nicely to whales, right? Now, during the El Nino, well, our guess was we should have low krill and low whales, right? That's what should happen, right? Really low krill and low whales. We were half right. We had mediocre krill. We had record numbers of whales. We had never seen so many whales as we saw in Monterey Bay during the El Nino. I mean, the running joke was you could, if you could jump relatively well, you could kind of leapfrog from Santa Cruz to Monterey on the backs of whales in Monterey Bay, right? Okay, like that old thing where people run across a swamp on the backs of alligators, right? And we said, wow, I guess we don't understand our system very well. And it's not that we didn't understand our system, it's that we made the classic mistake of engineers and ecologists, and that was applying appropriate scale to your question, right? You have to apply the right scale when you're trying to figure something out. And we were applying one scale to two organisms that operate on different scales. And I'm going to explain that. This is what the chlorophyll distribution at the peak of production season in spring looks like in an El Nino and a La Nina. In an El Nino, chlorophyll is limited to a very narrow band along the coast. Most of that is not from upwelling, it's from coastal runoff and mixing and resuspension by storms that in the water shallow enough that the nutrients aren't lost from the system, right? So you have a very narrow band of productivity along the coast. Now, if we go apply that same philosophy that we just went through, that means that's where you're gonna have phytoplankton, that's where you're gonna get krill, and that's where you're gonna get krill predators. During the La Nina, the phytoplankton gets spread well offshore. There's a very broad, expansive productive zone, a lot of phytoplankton. And so the phytoplankton is distributed and the krill is distributed appropriately broadly. So you can look at the amount of orange and red in this diagram as a proxy for the seating capacity or the size of the restaurant or the location of restaurants, right? So if you turn it all in, if we were to take a cross view of the Pacific Basin on the West Coast, this would be the shore. This would be going from onshore to offshore here, shallow water, deep water. Normally, during a normal condition, or even to more extent during a La Nina, you have very strong coastal upwelling, very strong cold water being brought to the surface, which creates a very strong offshore advection of that nutrient-rich cold surface water. And so if you're a plankton, whether it's phytoplankton or zooplankton, you're going to get spread over a very broad zone of the coastal region, well offshore. So if you're a whale, you got a lot of choices about where you can eat. But now let's take a La Nina. In a La Nina, El Nino, the warm water from offshore is pushing in. In fact, the winds come more from the south during El Ninos, which causes the opposite phenomena of upwelling. It causes downwelling. So where's all the particulate material going to be? The plankton and the phytoplankton is going to be concentrated in a very narrow band near the coast. So if you're a whale looking for something to eat, you don't have a lot of choices, right? So we were looking at, let me get my little pen going here. We were looking at this scale here. But whales operate at this scale. So we were making inferences about what we see here when we should have been thinking about the bigger picture. And in fact, we weren't that far off. Food is limiting during El Nino, but it's restricted in certain areas. And these are temporal and spatial refuges during hard environmental times. Whales really rely on this system to find food when the conditions are stark in the overall ocean ecosystem. And if there was ever any justification to make places like Monterey Bay, where you have deep water close to the coast, protected for as a resource, a foraging resource for these organisms during stressful environmental times, the result of this work just drives that point even farther home. So a very big lesson to us is that always apply the appropriate scale when trying to understand a phenomena or your system. We made that mistake. We were using Monterey Bay scale. We should have been using ocean basin, or at least California coastal region scale to put our problem into context. And I think that's all I have. So hopefully that was about the right amount of time. I don't know, Barry, was that about right?
We're a little bit over, but that is fine. Okay, so let's open this up to questions. So if people have a question, you can unmute yourself and ask Baldo. It was really, you know, I knew pieces of this, Baldo, but you really put it together beautifully. I never quite understood the upwelling thing, but that was great. Questions for Baldo?
It looks like Nancy has her hand raised.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much. But how do whales actually keep track of time?
I'm going to answer that. I'm going to answer that with a joke. A traveling salesman runs out of gas. He starts walking back to a farmhouse to borrow some gas from the farmer. As he's walking by an orchard, he sees the farmer holding a piglet and raising it to an apple tree, and the pig is eating an apple. And he watches this for about 3 minutes, and he can't help himself. He says, "Excuse me, but what on earth are you doing?" And the farmer says, "Isn't it obvious? I'm feeding my pig." And the salesman says, "Yeah, but doesn't that take a lot of time?" And the farmer says, "What the hell is time to a pig?" So my answer is that time doesn't mean the same to whales as us. It's more about rhythm and season. They're tuned into a rhythm and they respond. And a lot of that behavior is tied into behaviors that have been selected on evolutionary timescales. You just do that. It's why birds fly south in the winter. This is what you do during the time of year. Now, there are probably some learned behaviors that enter in that mix where, whale calves will spend several years with their mother, and they learn how to move around and look for food, how to dive down and locate. I'm sure they learn all that from their mother. But the behaviors that sort of shape how whales go around on a large scale looking for food have been shaped by these sort of predictable seasonal events that drive them. And they just respond to not so much time, but oceanic conditions, when the winds blow a certain way or whatever. Yeah.
Well, so the birds, for birds, the light changes, but I'm just wondering, do whales use light or to know what the season is, or what do they?
I don't know. I think for whales, the season is more dictated by the physical and chemical conditions of the water they're in and the wind, but they certainly use light. Whales use light. They can detect light for short-term things, maybe locating their krill at depth. They also can use light as a proxy for navigation, like any animals. They can look at the angle of the light in the sun and things like that. So they use light for a lot of cues. But really, in the ocean medium, whales have really come to rely a lot more on sound for long-term navigation. So they use sound. Toothed whales use sound to locate things with echolocation. Baleen whales don't have echolocation. They produce much lower frequency sounds that travel much farther in the ocean, but they have very good hearing, and they might use that sound for two things. If you go into a dark room and it's big and it's full of furniture, you hear one sound. But if there's no furniture, you hear another sound. So you can use sound to sort of give you awareness about your environment, even if you aren't actually echolocating. And they can also perhaps communicate over long distances using the sound. And there's some evidence that they do this. They'll start vocalizing when they find krill aggregation. And a colleague of mine did some work with closely related fin whales in the Gulf of Mexico. They found that when there was a krill swarm, whales would start vocalizing. And when they started looking a little closer by getting biopsy samples, shooting little crossbows with little biopsy, they could get a sample of their blubber, they could sex them and genetically identify them. Turned out that it was the males making all the noise. And they figured out a male whale finds a patch of krill and puts it out there that he's found a patch of krill, and wouldn't all you lovely ladies love to come and eat some of my krill? And then maybe we could talk afterwards about starting a family, right? So, but the point is that they can make these vocalizations that can travel several hundred, if not thousands of miles in the ocean because they're such low frequency.
Okay, so let me say we're a little over our time.
I'm sorry, I'll go on forever.
No. So let me say that if people need to leave, we're glad everybody came, and we'll stay in touch. But if Baldo's willing, there are people who have questions here, and so we'll continue on with the questions. So Cindy, you had your hand up.
Right.
Oh, she just asked that question.
No, there was a recent NOVA about krill, and we're worried because of global warming and the Antarctic ice shelf. They were finding that the juvenile krill needed the ice shelf to feed, and was wondering what impact that had.
Huge. I actually was part of the first group that kind of really looked into that. But way back in 1987, I participated in the first NSF wind cruise, a winter cruise. Usually you don't go down to the Antarctic in the winter. It's not a nice place. So we went down an icebreaker and we were diving under these sea ice aggregations. It's actually not the ice shelf, it's the sea ice. The ice shelf is really thick, several hundred feet thick, but the sea ice forms annually, and it can be anywhere from 1 to 2 meters in thickness. And what happens in the sea ice is you get these ice algae communities growing on the underside. They live in these brine pockets in the ice, and they form a very important overwintering food resource for the juvenile krill. They'll actually swim around underneath and scrape these ice algae off of that. And excuse me, I got to let my dog out. She's
Okay.
See, it's usually cats, but
Right.
and that's their food resource. And so what they find is multi-year ice builds up big communities of that. But when the ice melts, you don't have that. And so without this critical overwintering foraging resource, it really impacts the health and survivorship of the juveniles and causes very poor recruitment to the adult populations. That's just one of the many things. So it's the lack of sea ice. It's also the acidification has impacts on the development of the larvae and the survivorship of the larvae. So there are a lot of impacts global warming has on krill populations.
Okay, Antonio.
is it hitting up here? I mean, is it still,
it's
do
not
we
the
notice
same
it
here.
in our?
They don't rely on the sea ice, but the acidification certainly could have an impact on that. People are looking into that right now. Yeah. Is it Antonin, right?
Hi, I understand that people are exploiting krill as a resource, and I'm concerned about that. Can you tell us anything?
Yeah, that's been a concern. In fact, they created a whole multi-nation cooperative called CAMLAR, of which the U.S. is part of it, AMLAR, and that's its main tasking is to monitor and study the krill abundance layers to make sure that there's sufficient biomass to sustain the Southern Ocean ecosystem in particular. So they participate in these monitoring practices, and there is most commercial krill harvest occurs in the Southern Ocean because they're targeting this big species. And it's used for a variety of things. Most of it traditionally was used as a cheap source of protein. And it wasn't be eaten by humans. It would be used as protein supplement for livestock and chicken. Cheap protein. You go out down, you trawl it and bring it up. But also now it's very popular krill oil, and it's used for products of krill oil. I know on the West Coast here, we preemptively worked on legislation to get commercial krill harvesting banned. And we did it before anyone was doing it. And the easiest time to get something banned is when you have no stakeholders relying on it. So it's illegal to harvest krill on the West Coast of the United States. There are a few small fisheries for aquarium food only by special permit. So yes, it is a problem and is monitored, and it's going to be an evolving problem because as krill stocks fluctuate, the ability to regulate them is going to have to necessarily be modified.
Okay.
You know, I want to, Constantine had his hand up for the longest time. Let's ask him. Yeah.
Okay. The others have asked the other two questions I had. What about the effects of mining the bottom, the ocean, and how that affects the nutrients and so forth?
Yeah.
Because when you mine, you just take out the minerals,
Right.
and the nutrients fall back to hopefully back to the bottom where they should be.
So you're a little out of my wheelhouse here, but I would think that most of the ocean mining that I think of that is really centered to this is for these either phosphate or manganese nodules, right?
Right. Right.
And the manganese and phosphate down there is really kind of sequestered from the biological system. So while it may have impacts, there's all kinds of impacts with mining. Whenever you go down and start scraping stuff on the bottom,
Right.
You're doing a lot of damage. But in terms of altering the
nutrients,
availability of the nutrients to the surface, not so much of an impact. I think if any impact, it would be more of this on a similar vein to when we started liberating hydrocarbons for burning for fuel. You're taking an element that is locked up in a sequestered reservoir and now liberating it into a system that wasn't part of, and it may have unforeseen consequences. So if it's in the case of phosphates, I can imagine it could spur on, by extra nutrients being liberated in the system, things like eutrophication and other environmental degradation. That would be my sense of the most acute impact something like that would have, other than the physical damage the mining exerts on these often very sensitive habitats you find these structures in.
Thank you.
Harriet. Oh, you have to unmute. Yeah. Harriet, I think you have to unmute yourself.
Yes, thank you. And thank you for your wonderful, enlightening talk. Well presented. A few years ago, there were congregations of blue whales up to 20. And the fisher folk were reporting on that. And articles appeared in the newspapers suggesting it was because the red crabs had come north and they were a possible, an interesting food source. And then I found that was challenged by people saying, oh, no, blue whales only eat krill. What is the story on that?
Well, that's a really nuanced and excellent question, and I'm really and I can actually speak to this to some degree. So it's true that blue whales in general are what we call a stenophagic species. They have a very narrow diet. They won't eat fish. They almost exclusively eat krill. The one exception is they will eat aggregations of these pleuroncodes, these pelagic red crab, which are very similar to krill. So they will feed on crabs. It's just that it's very rare that they occur in the aggregations where blue whales are to target them. So they will feed on these pleuroncodes. It's just not a very normal phenomenon. Now, I don't know whether there were pleuroncodes aggregations. They typically only show up here in El Niños, right? But I know in the southern part of their distribution, blue whales will feed on them. But it's a very small overall percentage of their diet, because it's not a very common situation. They'll find them in the aggregations they have to be to effectively feed on them. So it's true, they will feed on them. It's the one exception to the krill rule for blue whales.
Okay, well, I think we maybe have come to the end. That was superb. Really, really interesting, really educational, and as Harriet said, well presented. You've had a lot of teaching practice, Baldo. Okay, so thank you very much.
It's my pleasure. I really enjoyed it.
Everybody for participating.
Thank you so much.
Okay,
And
thank you for having me.
It was wonderful. Thank you.
Very good.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Bye-bye.
Okay. Okay.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.